While I was deployed overseas serving my country, my wife convinced my elderly mother to change our family trust. My name is Finn Hole, 37 years old, and 17 years into my career as a communications officer in the United States Army. I had just finished a 9-month rotation on a forward operating base, handling intel transmissions and counting the days until I could walk barefoot on Kentucky bluegrass again. 3 days after I landed back in Lexington, I found the documents in my mother's desk drawer. The family trust, originally set up by my father before his death, had been changed. Not just amended, but completely overhauled. My wife, Marissa, was now listed as the primary trustee. My mother, Evelyn, had been bumped down to secondary beneficiary. The document was dated 4 months into my deployment. I sat in the study of my childhood home holding the file, reading every line twice. This house had been with us for 3 generations. The 15 acres it rested on were some of the most beautiful countryside in Kentucky. My father had always made it clear it was to stay in the family, no exceptions. That was his wish. That was the promise I intended to keep. "Everything okay in here?" Marissa stood in the doorway, leaning casually against the frame. Her blonde hair was pulled back, and she wore the diamond earrings I'd sent for our anniversary 2 years ago. I slid the documents back into the folder. "Just looking through some things. Your mom's finances were a mess," she said lightly. "I organized it all while you were away. Someone had to step in." I nodded, unsure if I could trust my voice. "I've been handling her bills, managing the property taxes," she went on. "The trust needed to be updated." Your mother agreed completely. From the living room, I could hear the TV blaring. My mother was watching a game show at full volume, chuckling at something the host said. She was 82 now and had started to forget things more often. On our last few video calls from the base, she struggled to remember the day of the week. "Thanks for keeping things in order," I managed. "I just need a little time to settle back in." Marissa smiled warmly. "Of course. Take all the time you need." That night, long after she'd gone to bed, I sat on the back porch, watching the silhouettes of oak trees stretch across the night sky. I thought about my father, a career military man like me. He always said the loudest person in the room is rarely the strongest. That voice echoed in my mind as I tried to make sense of everything. The next morning, I kissed Marissa goodbye as she left for her job at Sundale Financial. I told her I planned to spend the day with my mom. She didn't notice me slipping the trust documents into my jacket pocket. I'd met Marissa 10 years ago at a coffee shop near Fort Campbell. She was magnetic, ambitious, articulate, and had a way of making people feel seen. We were married within the year. She and my mom had always gotten along, something I was deeply thankful for, especially after Dad passed 5 years ago. Dad had been the one with the plan. The steady hand. When he was diagnosed with lung cancer, he made sure everything was squared away. "Take care of your mother," he told me on his last day. "And the house, the land, it stays in the family. That's non-negotiable." He'd set up the trust to protect that wish. I thought it was ironclad. But over the years, Marissa would bring it up, how we were living in a rental while all that land just sat there unused. "We could build something beautiful here," she'd say. "Make it ours." I never agreed. That land was for my mother's peace. Her final chapter. In the last 3 years, my deployments had increased. Each time I came home, I noticed changes. Small, gradual ones. My mother leaned more on Marissa. My wife had taken over everything: finances, medications, doctor's visits. "She's forgetful," Marissa would say. "She needs the help, Finn." At first, it made sense. But eventually it didn't. On my second day home, I took my mother to lunch, just the two of us. We went to Bellamy's, the same diner she and Dad used to visit after Sunday church. The place still smelled like coffee and biscuits. We sat by the window. "How are you really doing, Mom?" I asked once we'd ordered. She smiled at me, her hands trembling just slightly. She sipped her water and gave a small shrug. Oh, you know. Getting by. Marissa's been so helpful. I saw the trust was changed, I said, careful to keep my voice steady. She looked puzzled. Was it the papers I signed a few months ago? About the house. The house and the land, I clarified. Mom frowned, thinking hard. Marissa brings me so many papers to sign. Bills and things. She always explains them, but… Her voice trailed off. I get mixed up sometimes. A tightness formed in my chest. What kind of papers? Insurance? Bank forms? She said it was to protect our assets while you were away. That you'd want her to take over the finances. She leaned in. Did I do something wrong, Finn? I reached across the table and gently took her hand. No, Mom. You didn't do anything wrong. On the drive back home, she dozed off in the passenger seat. I glanced over at her, so small now, her features softened by age. While she slept, I called an old army buddy who had transitioned into law. Don't confront your wife just yet, he warned after I told him everything. We need to figure out how deep this goes. 3 days later, I wasn't even looking for proof. I was helping Mom sort through old family photos when she mentioned something odd. Marissa brought over that nice statement last week, she said. What statement? From the bank, she replied cheerfully. She said the investments were doing really well. I followed her to the nightstand beside her bed. She pulled out a maroon folder. Inside were printouts, statements from 3 separate accounts I had never seen before. 2 of them were brand new joint accounts, one checking, one savings, with both Marissa's and my mother's names on them. Marissa had full withdrawal privileges. The third was a brokerage account. My stomach dropped as I flipped through the documents. It was the same account where my father's lifelong investments had been parked, nearly $400,000 in mutual funds, bonds, and blue-chip stocks. That money was meant to sustain my mother for the rest of her life. But the balance was much lower than I remembered. I kept flipping. $78,000 had been withdrawn over the last 6 months, chunks of $5,000 here, $10,000 there. Each slip bore my mother's signature, wobbly, inconsistent. I sat down on the edge of her bed, the documents spread around me like pieces of a puzzle I didn't want to solve. This wasn't impulsive. This was methodical. Calculated. Planned. Mom stood at the doorway, her brow creased with concern. Are the numbers good? Marissa says not to worry about the details. I forced a smile and carefully stacked the statements. Everything's fine, Mom. I'm just catching up. That night, Marissa suggested we go out to celebrate my return. We had dinner downtown at a place I used to reserve for anniversaries. She wore a fitted navy dress I hadn't seen before and jewelry that sparkled under the soft lighting. She ordered champagne. You seem quiet, she said, brushing her fingers across mine. Still adjusting? I gave a small nod. Yeah, just getting back into the rhythm of being home. I've been thinking, she said brightly, her eyes lighting up. Now that you're back, we should start talking seriously about building on your mother's land. I've even spoken to an architect, just preliminary sketches. I took a slow sip of water. And what happens to my mom? Oh, we'd take care of her, obviously. But that house is too big for her now. There's a really lovely assisted living place near my office. Very exclusive. That was the moment it clicked. The trust. The accounts. The timing. It wasn't just opportunistic. She'd been laying this groundwork for years, waiting until I was thousands of miles away and my mother was at her most vulnerable. I didn't confront her. I didn't raise my voice. I nodded and smiled in all the right places as she described her dream kitchen and panoramic windows looking over what she now referred to as our land. I think I need a few weeks to decompress, I said finally. Ease back into civilian life before we make any big calls. She looked disappointed but composed herself quickly. Of course. Take all the time you need. I excused myself to the restroom. In the hallway, I pulled out my phone and called my attorney friend. I need everything you've got on elder financial abuse and how to challenge a trust, I whispered. And I need it yesterday. When I returned to the table, I felt something I hadn't felt in days: clarity. The weight of betrayal still sat on my shoulders, but with it came a sharp sense of purpose. I now understood exactly what I was up against, and what I had to protect. 1 week later, I drove to Louisville to meet with Harold Lerner, an estate attorney recommended by my friend. Harold was sharp, with a kind demeanor that immediately put me at ease. I handed him the copies of the trust, the bank statements, and the brokerage slips. He leafed through them, frowning. "This doesn't look good, Finn." "Not at all. But you did the right thing by documenting everything quietly." "What are my options?" I asked. "We'll start by filing a petition to challenge the amended trust and request a full audit of the financial activity. If your mother's signature was obtained under undue influence, or if she lacked capacity when she signed, we can invalidate it." "And criminal charges?" He nodded. "That's up to the DA, but from what you've shown me, your wife could be looking at charges related to financial exploitation. Possibly even fraud." I didn't feel vindicated. I felt sick. This wasn't a stranger. This was someone I had loved, trusted, shared my life with. But love doesn't blind you forever. Eventually it burns off, and what's left is the truth. Specialized in elder law, Harold's office was tucked into an old brick building that smelled like polished wood and quiet urgency. I drove the 60 miles alone, telling Marissa I was catching up with a few Army buddies. After reviewing the trust papers and account records, Harold folded his hands and gave me a long look. "Your mother was likely coerced," he said, his voice steady but cautious. "But proving that won't be simple." "Was she given a cognitive assessment around the time these documents were signed?" "Not that I know of," I replied, leaning forward. "But lately, she's forgetting names, repeating questions. She asked me the date 3 times yesterday." Harold nodded slowly. "Then we need a formal evaluation. If she's showing signs of cognitive decline now, we can argue that those symptoms were present when she signed. Especially if there's a clear pattern." I left his office with a plan and a quiet fire building in my chest. The next day, I took my mother to see Dr. Eleanor Jenkins, a local geriatric specialist. After a series of memory and comprehension tests, the doctor confirmed what I had feared: early-stage dementia, likely developing over the past year or longer. "Has anyone else mentioned these symptoms?" Dr. Jenkins asked. "My wife," I replied. "She's been managing my mom's affairs while I was deployed." Dr. Jenkins raised an eyebrow. "And she never thought to request a medical evaluation?" I shook my head. "Apparently not." With a diagnosis in hand, I knew I couldn't stay silent any longer. But I didn't want to fight. Not yet. That night, once Mom had gone to bed, Marissa and I sat at the kitchen table. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. "I took Mom to see a specialist today," I began. "She's showing signs of dementia." Marissa's face changed, just slightly. "That's awful. But not surprising," she said after a beat. "I've noticed her memory issues for some time." "Before or after she signed the trust amendment?" I asked. Her eyes narrowed. "What are you implying, Finn?" "Just trying to establish a timeline," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "For the doctors." "I've done nothing but help your mother," she said sharply. "While you were overseas, I was here, handling everything. Who else was going to do it? Certainly not you." "You're right," I replied. "And I appreciate what you've done. But I'm concerned about some financial decisions that were made." "What financial decisions?" she snapped. "The trust. The new joint accounts. The withdrawals. All for your mother's care," she said, her voice rising. "And for household needs. Everything is documented. I'd like to see that documentation." She stood up suddenly, grabbing her keys off the counter. I don't appreciate being interrogated like this. Not after everything I've sacrificed. Your mother agreed to all of it. A woman with dementia, I said quietly. She wasn't diagnosed at the time. Marissa shot back. Then she stormed out, the front door slamming behind her. I sat alone in the kitchen, letting the silence settle. The old floorboards creaked faintly above me. I thought of my father, of his insistence on protecting our family's legacy, and I knew he would have never let this slide. The next morning, I got a call from my bank. Someone had tried to access my personal savings account, an account Marissa had no legal access to. The attempt failed due to incorrect password entries, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. That afternoon, I found a certified letter addressed to my mother. It was from Cornerstone Assisted Living, confirming her upcoming move-in. The date was set for 3 weeks from now. The contract had her signature on it, dated just 3 days after I'd returned home. When I showed it to Mom, she stared at the letter in confusion. I don't remember this place, she said. Did I agree to move? Marissa says you did, I replied gently, watching her face. She shook her head, slow and firm. I don't want to leave my home, Finn. I promised your father I'd stay here. That night, I changed all my passwords and added security alerts on my accounts. I froze my credit reports and backed up every file I had related to the trust and finances. Then I called Harold again. It's worse than we thought, I told him. And she knows I'm digging. She's trying to move Mom out. 2 days after the confrontation, I drove to the county clerk's office. I needed to see the original trust amendment, not the copy that Marissa had kept in the file drawer, but the official version filed with the county. The clerk, a silver-haired woman named Gladys, greeted me with a kind smile. Whole family trust? She asked, flipping through the cabinet drawers. Yes, I replied. I'd like to review the latest amendment. She slid a thick folder across the counter. It's all here. I opened the file and stared at the notarized signature on the amendment. It was dated during my deployment, just as I suspected. But what caught my eye was the notary stamp, signed and sealed by a name I recognized. Not just any notary. Someone with direct ties to Marissa's former employer. A connection I hadn't known existed until that moment. And then I saw it. Something that made my stomach drop. The notary stamp. The amendment had been notarized by someone named Lauren Davis. Do you know this notary? I asked Gladys. She adjusted her glasses and squinted at the stamp. Lauren? Of course. She's with the Westbrook Law Office. Has been for years. Westbrook Law. My heart thudded in my chest. That was the same firm where Marissa's college roommate, Vanessa Westbrook, was a senior partner. A name Marissa had never once mentioned when talking about the trust revisions. I thanked Gladys and drove straight to Westbrook Law. The receptionist told me Vanessa was in court for the day, but that her associate Lauren Davis was available. Lauren came out a few minutes later, her posture rigid, smile tight. You're Marissa's husband, she said, not quite meeting my eyes. I am, I replied. I believe you notarized a trust amendment for my mother about 6 months ago. She gave a curt nod. Yes. Everything was in order. Was my mother present when she signed the document? She hesitated. I don't recall the specifics. I lowered my voice. Let me help you recall. Was my wife present during the signing? I really can't discuss this. My mother has dementia. Diagnosed. That amendment stripped her of control over assets she's managed for decades. And it was all done while I was deployed overseas. Her face drained of color. Mr. Holt. I think you should speak with Vanessa about this. I plan to, I said. But first I need to know, did you actually witness my mother sign those papers, or did you just stamp something Marissa handed you? Lauren stood abruptly. This conversation is over. That evening my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. Finn. the voice said, tight and urgent. It's Vanessa Westbrook. We need to talk. We met the next morning at a quiet cafe downtown. Vanessa looked sharp in her tailored navy suit, but the calm confidence I remembered from our one brief encounter years ago was gone. Her eyes were clouded with concern. Lauren told me about your visit, she began. I want to be clear, our firm takes notary standards very seriously. Did your office draft the amendment? I asked. She shook her head. No. Marissa brought it in, already prepared. She claimed it had been drafted by your family attorney, and said you were fully aware of it. And was my mother present when it was notarized? Vanessa looked down at her coffee. No. Marissa told us your mother was ill and couldn't come in. Lauren notarized it based on Marissa's assurance that the signature was genuine. That's legal, I said flatly. Vanessa nodded. It is. I've already reported the situation to the State Bar. Lauren has been suspended pending the investigation. I studied her. Why are you telling me all this? Because I've known Marissa since college, she said, her voice low. And I never thought she'd. She's not who I believed she was. She paused. And there's more. I braced myself. Last year, she asked me questions, hypothetical, I thought, about liquidating property assets. About transferring funds offshore. I assumed it was for a client at her firm. But now, she shook her head. Now I'm not so sure. My mind reeled. Offshore transfers. Selling assets. That contract from the assisted living facility. How long had she been planning this? There's one more thing, Vanessa said, her voice quiet. 3 years ago, Marissa asked me how military pensions were divided in a divorce. She wanted to know how deployment affected spousal support calculations. I sat frozen. 3 years ago, right when my deployment schedule had intensified. Thank you, I said finally, my voice hollow. I left the cafe in a daze, and the moment I got into the car, I called Harold Lerner. I need to move fast, I told him. She's been laying this groundwork for years. But I didn't confront Marissa. Not yet. That night, over dinner, I smiled and nodded as she talked about the future. She mentioned knocking down the garage to expand the living space. Suggested selling off a portion of the land to cover my mother's care. Floated the idea of meeting with a financial advisor to streamline our investments. I listened. Took mental notes. And kept building my case. Dr. Jenkins had provided a detailed report on my mother's cognitive state. In it, she outlined signs of moderate decline with a likely onset dating back at least a year, if not more. The report noted lapses in memory, repetitive questioning, and poor comprehension, symptoms consistent with dementia and backed by clinical evaluation. I added the report to the growing file I had assembled. The trust amendment, the suspicious withdrawals, the forged signatures, and now a confirmed violation of notary protocol. I didn't know how it would all play out yet, but I knew I wasn't going to let my mother be pushed out of her home. And I wasn't going to let Marissa walk away with what generations before me had built. Harold Lerner moved swiftly. Within 48 hours, he'd filed emergency motions to freeze all trust assets and the joint accounts Marissa had opened. Meanwhile, I hired a private investigator. It didn't take long before he sent back a detailed log: designer clothing purchases, upscale lunches with real estate developers, and regular meetings with a luxury home builder. But there was something else. Something I hadn't anticipated. A lease. For an apartment in Louisville. Signed 6 months earlier. Under her maiden name, Donovan. 10 days into the investigation, Harold called again. The judge granted temporary guardianship of your mother, he said. And we've secured a hearing date for next week to contest the trust amendment. I thanked him and hung up, the tension in my chest lifting for the first time in days. That same evening, I moved my things out of the master bedroom and into the guest room. When Marissa asked about it, I told her I'd been having trouble sleeping since the deployment. I thrash around too much, I said. Didn't want to keep you up. In truth, I couldn't bear to sleep next to her anymore. 3 days before the hearing, I received a small, nondescript package from the investigator. Inside was a flash drive. It contained financial data that Marissa had attempted to delete from her laptop. The drive held evidence of credit card payments, tens of thousands of dollars paid using my mother's accounts. Over $40,000 gone in 6 months. The transfers were deliberate, methodical, and personal. That night, as I stood at the kitchen counter sipping black coffee, Marissa came in quietly. "We need to talk about your mother," she said, her tone unusually soft. "The assisted living facility needs an answer by Friday." I didn't look up immediately. "I'm not sure that's the right move for her." She exhaled hard. "Finn, be realistic. She can't live alone. And we're not trained to handle someone with progressing dementia. We've managed so far." "That's because I've been handling everything," she said, her voice rising slightly. "But it's not sustainable. This facility is excellent. And the trust will cover the costs." I met her gaze. "The trust? The one you had her sign while I was deployed?" A flicker of emotion crossed her face, fatigue, or maybe guilt, but it was gone in a blink. Replaced by her usual calm concern. I did what needed to be done. Someone had to make those decisions. "I appreciate that," I replied. "But I'd still like to explore other options before we make any moves." Her lips pressed into a tight smile. "The deposit is non-refundable after Friday." "You already made a deposit?" "Of course. Good facilities have long waitlists. I put down $15,000 to reserve her spot." She touched my arm gently. "From her account, not ours." "Don't worry." I nodded, cataloging every word. "Let me sleep on it," I said. "We'll talk in the morning." The next day, I visited the facility myself. The director was kind, well-spoken. But when I asked about the waitlist, her brow furrowed. "We don't currently have a waitlist," she said. "Several units are available immediately." "What about the deposit?" I asked. She checked her system. $5,000 paid by Marissa Donovan. Just 5. Not 15. 10,000 unaccounted for. Another missing puzzle piece now in place. That afternoon, I finalized every remaining detail with Harold. We reviewed the timeline, cross-referenced the medical reports, and finished compiling our evidence. The forensic accountant had completed her review and found a consistent pattern of misappropriation. The hearing was scheduled for the next morning. I hadn't told Marissa. She'd learn when the sheriff's deputy knocked on our door. That night, I returned to the back porch, the same spot I'd sat weeks earlier, trying to piece together what had gone wrong. The oak trees rustled gently in the breeze, standing strong against the coming fall. They were planted by my grandfather. I remembered how my father used to point to them and say, "Some roots aren't meant to be moved." For the first time in a long time, I felt something like peace. At exactly 7 a.m., the doorbell rang. I stayed in the kitchen, sipping coffee. Marissa, still in her robe, answered. I watched as she opened the door to a sheriff's deputy, who handed her a manila envelope and offered a quick explanation. She took it, her brows furrowing, then slowly opened the packet. "What is this?" she asked, turning toward me, her voice sharp with confusion. "A court hearing," I said calmly. "Today." She flipped through the papers. "To invalidate the trust amendment? Are you serious? And to address the financial irregularities," I added. Her face turned crimson. "Financial? This is ridiculous." "I've done, there's nothing wrong," I said evenly. "The hearing is at 10 a.m., Judge Harriman's courtroom. You should probably call your attorney." Marissa stood frozen, the papers trembling in her hands. "You've been planning this the whole time," she said, her voice breaking. Pretending everything was fine. I met her gaze without flinching. Learn from the best. We arrived separately at the courthouse. Marissa showed up with a last-minute legal team from her firm. I arrived with Harold Lerner and my mother, who sat quietly beside me, her hands folded in her lap, looking fragile but composed. Judge Elaine Harmon, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s, opened the proceedings briskly. "This hearing concerns the validity of amendments made to the whole family trust," she announced. For the next 2 hours, Harold laid out our case with precision. Dr. Jenkins took the stand and described my mother's cognitive decline, explaining the signs of early dementia that had been developing for well over a year. The forensic accountant presented clear evidence of the questionable transfers and credit card payments tied to Marissa. Vanessa Westbrook testified about the improper notarization, how her associate had stamped the documents without my mother being present, relying solely on Marissa's word. The private investigator followed, submitting photographs and financial records, including proof of the secret Louisville apartment and the inconsistencies with the assisted living deposit. Marissa sat rigid the entire time, whispering furiously to her attorneys. Her face was pale but her jaw was set. When it was her turn to speak, she took the stand and attempted to reshape the narrative. "I've sacrificed so much," she said, her voice carefully measured. "My career. My time. I stepped in when no one else would. Every financial decision was made to protect Evelyn's well-being." She looked at the judge, then back at me. "I never once acted out of self-interest." That's when Harold calmly placed a set of recordings on the table. Audio clips played in the courtroom, Marissa's voice, clear and confident, discussing development proposals with real estate investors. "We can do whatever we want with the land once the old woman is relocated," she said in one clip. "You'll have full access to build," she said in another. Judge Harriman's expression hardened as the courtroom fell silent. She looked over the transcript, then back to Marissa, her voice steady as stone. "This court finds clear and convincing evidence that Evelyn Hull lacked the legal capacity to execute the amended trust," she ruled. "Furthermore, there is substantial evidence of undue influence and financial exploitation by Marissa Hull." Her verdict was swift and comprehensive. The trust was to be restored to its original version, immediately. Marissa was barred from ever serving as trustee or beneficiary in any capacity. All joint accounts were to be closed, with every dollar returned to my mother's sole control. A full forensic audit was ordered to trace the flow of funds and recover what had been misused. "And finally," Judge Harmon concluded, "this case will be referred to the District Attorney's Office for potential prosecution of elder financial abuse and fraud." Marissa didn't look at me as she left the courtroom. I didn't watch her go. Instead, I turned to my mother. She gave my hand a firm squeeze. "Your father would be proud," she whispered, her voice barely audible but full of emotion. 1 week later, I moved her into the small guest house at the back of our property. The same structure my father had once used as his workshop. I hired a full-time nurse to assist with her care, funding everything with what we'd recovered from Marissa's spree. The divorce papers were filed the day after the hearing. Marissa didn't fight them. I later learned she'd left Kentucky entirely, relocating to Colorado where her sister lived. The apartment in Louisville had been abandoned, the lease forfeited. She took only what she could carry in 2 suitcases. That was the last I heard of her. Some evenings, I still sit out on the back porch, watching the same oak trees my father once loved. Their roots run deep, just like our family's legacy. The land remains with us, untouched, protected. Just as he intended. The trust is secure now, with my younger cousin Jason, freshly licensed and full of idealism, serving as co-trustee alongside me. He understands what's at stake. He understands why it matters. I don't spend time thinking about Marissa anymore. Some betrayals are too deep for anger to sustain. They leave a scar, but the pain fades. What matters is what remains. Morning coffee with Mom. Weekend visits from old Army friends. Long walks across our fields. Quiet evenings with no deception hanging in the air. Just peace. My father used to say a man's true strength isn't measured by how fiercely he fights, but by how wisely he acts when the dust has settled. For the first time, I understand exactly what he meant.